Hello, hello, hola, hola. Welcome back to a Walk Around Puerto Rico. My name is Daniela and this is
Hanna.
And today we'll be talking about Puerto Rico and United States history and relations. Sit down tight. This is a pretty heavy lecture, but we'll try to keep it fun and as truthful and sane as we can. Okay, Hannah, do you want to intro us?
Sure. Yeah, in the live class, we had our introductions and mini discussion as we usually do. And again, we encourage you to ask these questions, talk about these things with your friends and family. And if not, just keep them in mind during the lesson. First, a little lighter thing, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? And then extending from that, how is the culture of a place formed, and why is it important to maintain and preserve the culture of people in specifically a colonized place? And what food or art do you know of that came about from multiple cultures colliding? And one of those ways that the cultures do collide is through colonization, and those effects do get felt.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we'll get started with a timeline. And this is specifically about US rule and interactions with Puerto Rico. And that came, the US first started getting involved as Spain was loosening their hold on Puerto Rico. So on November 25th of 1897, the Spanish government granted Puerto Rico self-government, or Carta Autonómica. And then the following spring came the Spanish-American War, which started with the USS Maine exploding, which was a US warship that was stationed in Havana. So because it exploded while it was in Havana, the US got involved in the Cuban War for Independence against Spain. And so Cuba and Puerto Rico are very closely intertwined, and not far from then, the US set their sights on Puerto Rico. So this was in April, they joined the Cuban War for independence against Spain. And then they go to Puerto Rico and they assert that they would help the Jibaros gain independence from Spanish colonial rule. And so while Carta Autonómica was established, the Jibaros wanted to get this Spain out once and for all. So the US was kind of playing both sides, where they decided, okay, we're gonna help Cuba and we're gonna help Puerto Rico. But what they did instead was they installed themselves as new colonial rulers. So in July 25th, they offered their help to the Jibaros, and by December 10th of the same year, 1898, Puerto Rico would be handed over from Spanish rule and become a US Commonwealth in a Treaty of Paris. So that was just over a year that it took for Puerto Rico to get independence within their grasp, and then total shift of rule from November 25th, 1897 to December 10th, 1898. And so US citizenship was granted to Puerto Ricans only in 1917 on March 2nd with the Jones-Shafroth Act. And in this, Puerto Rico became an official US territory, and it granted citizenship, but specifically without voting, without representation in the government. And along with granting citizenship, this act made it so then the government of Puerto Rico would become redesigned as a parallel to the US Constitution and US government structure. So there is a Bill of Rights, the executive, legislative, and judicial government branches established, and then finally, English was established as the official language. But as you might remember in our previous class on language, that didn't stick for very long because the Spanish was the main language of the island at that time, by that point. So and all their stuff, all the previous documents from before the US came there, they were in Spanish. Their schools were in Spanish. So it was finally shifted to being taught as a second language instead of being forced upon the island as an official language.
I also wanted to note that citizenship here was granted as statutory citizenship, which means it was granted by Congress, not by Constitution. And also, this meant that their new citizens could go to war, become soldiers for the U.S. Army. And it was only 2 months later where the president enacted an official draft for World War I. So there's a big army of Puerto Ricans that went to World War I and served for the country. So some of the things that also come up because of this new imposition of rule is threats to national identity. So Puerto Ricans have been building this national identity for over 400 years of Spanish colonial rule. And they had already established a culture, a way of being. And when the US comes in, the US sees this as a threat, and they outlaw the flag from December 10 to 1989, the flag that was established and already made for the island. Yes, it was more associated to like revolutionary groups and like nationalist groups. So this is why the US saw a need to outlaw the flag. But it was until 1952 that it was considered a felony actually to display the Puerto Rican flag in public. This goes in hand with the Gag Law, which was an act enacted by the US, appointed legislature to suppress nationalist and independentist movements. So anything that was related to these movements, so a flag, a hymn, any sort of just remembrance to this ideal of just becoming an independent nation was completely outlawed. Yes. So here a little bit about the flag version. So we're going to dive into the flags. So in 1895, a flag was made for Puerto Rico to sort of give a voice, a symbol to this whole movement. It started originally with the flag that it would become like the independentist flag, the flag that was used for El Grito de Lares, which is its whole other thing, but this is the one that was adopted from that. And the difference between these two flags is the tone of the triangle that has a star. So the sky blue triangle represents Puerto Rico's beautiful skies and seas, and the single star stands for the island. Whereas the one that was adopted in 1952 with the dark blue, it was more parallel to the United States government. So the United States has this flag with a square and a bunch of stars, and it's dark blue with red and white stripes. And so this was to symbolize like this connection to the United States. Um, it actually stands for the Republican government and its three branches. And the triangle contains a white five-pointed star to signify that Puerto Rico was a territory, hence representing the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The red stripes signify bloodshed of the brave Puerto Ricans and the quest for freedom, and the white stripes symbolize the Puerto Rican triumph in their quest for independence, as well as the peace that they hope to attain. So as you can see, the original flag with these messages were very much a cry for this yearning of independence and becoming their own nation. And the meaning behind the adopted 1952 flag, well, it is more so aligning with the Commonwealth and the US territory train of thought. Hanna will intro Don Pedro Albizu Campos.
Yes, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, he was born in September of 1891, so just after the US rule was installed. He's a Puerto Rican attorney and politician and the leading figure in the Puerto Rican independence movement. He also spoke 6 languages and he graduated from Harvard with the highest GPA in his class. So this man was no joke. He was very smart. He was very capable. He was an independentist leader. So a threat to American colonial government. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party formed as a direct response to the American colonial government. And that party, they aimed to have an armed overthrow of the government in Puerto Rico. And they had hoped that in forming this party and planning an armed revolt, that the UN would recognize them as a liberatory group trying to gain independence for a place that is under colonial rule. That is not what ended up happening. The plans were discovered and he was imprisoned for 26 years for his attempt to overthrow the United States government. And during that time, he had alleged that he was poisoned with radiation. And so that might seem like an absurd claim coming out of nowhere. But the US Department of Energy ultimately did confirm that the US, without prisoners' consent, would do radiation testing on them. And finally, the Cuban Cancer Association confirmed that Don Pedro Albizu Campos had received high doses of radiation. And unfortunately, he ultimately passed in April 1965 due to heart failure, which may have very well been helped along by this radiation poisoning that he had undergone.
So, sorry.
Oh, good. All good. But yeah, that's regaining a sense of autonomy. So in 1951, Puerto Rican voters approved a referendum of a new US law granting the islanders the right to draft their own constitution. So at this point, the American Constitution had been installed by that earlier act, the Jones-Shafroth Act. But at this point, voters wanted a referendum. So in March of 1952, Luis Muñoz Marin, Puerto Rico's governor at the time, proclaimed Puerto Rico a freely associated US Commonwealth under the new constitution. So they were able to get this new constitution, and that status of being a freely associated US Commonwealth was made official that July. Yeah, it's a win.
Yeah. But even though there is this freely associated state, there is still a restrained economy. So there is, with the Jones-Shafroth Act, there's the cabotage laws were instilled. So this means that it restrained Puerto Rican commerce by only allowing it to sell products to the United States. And any imported goods must touch the US mainland soil and brought into Puerto Rico in a US flagship. So it had to go there, change ships, and then go to Puerto Rico. The Jones Act vessels shipping prices, like they've been studied and they've been concluded to be 2.5 times greater than if there were no Jones Act shipping from a foreign country or ports. So the Jones Act raises the price of shipping cargo to Puerto Rico by $568.9 million. And that price is $1.1 billion higher than it would be. That would be the case without the Jones Act. This, in turn, is estimated to mean 13,250 fewer jobs. And were they to exist, such jobs would mean $337.3 million more dollars in wages and over $1.5 billion in increased economic activity. So tax revenue would be around $106.4 million higher without the Jones Act. So definitely this is something that still affects the island. And it's been talked about repealing. And during the Hurricane Maria, it was actually like repealed and people were able to ship things in freely, but it's still a subject that is up for debate. And it definitely is one of the consequences why Puerto Rico is in such big debt with the United States. Also, when it comes to taxation and representation, when taxation, so since Puerto Rico lacks economic sovereignty, which means that they don't have their own dollar or they don't have their own form of currency, they can't establish any rules when it comes to economy in the island. So residents pay most federal taxes and their contributions total to $3.6 billion in 2016. But Puerto Rico generally do not pay a federal income tax, and they continue to enjoy tax exemptions that have been historically incentivized outside investment. Now, I put this quote up, and the term enjoyed is very much one up for debate, because then it follows the statement that it historically incentivizes outside investment. And when it comes to this, it's really outside investors that are enjoying these tax exemptions. They can come into the island and buy a piece of land without worrying about paying for taxes. So this all ties into a previous lesson about nature, where big developments such as the Christopher Columbus Resort bought a piece of land without recognizing the endangered species and wildlife and how this would impact the population surrounding them. It's a very sensitive subject then, because people are angry that foreigners can just come in and also not pay taxes to the local government for the use of the land and the development of it. But in other cases, it has been pretty good, because there was factories that were built on the island and therefore created a lot more jobs for local people there. But again, it's a topic that is still being debated and needs a lot of more research to be done. And definitely we we exhort you to go out and do this research because it's definitely something that impacts Puerto Ricans day to day. And yeah, and Americans have more control over that than we do. So it's important to be educated and elect representatives that have these considerations in mind. Talking about representatives, though, we also have Puerto Ricans only have one non-voting resident commissioner in the House of Representatives. So this is our current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, and yeah, her job is to maybe speak, but at the end of the day, there's no vote that she can put in a ballot in favor of Puerto Ricans. So again, taxation and representation are very much this topic that needs a lot of backing up. And
thank you for helping to start the unpacking process of that. And with all this information, we have a project related to that, where you can use the colors of the flag, but try to illustrate within the shapes of the flag what you think represents the island nation. What should the island nation's flag represent and hold in it, because it obviously has a very powerful history in all forms that it has been. So yeah, we encourage you to print this out and take time and reflect on what you've learned today, and process that through some art and creativity. We'll definitely link that below. And yeah.
Yes. So talking a little bit about Puerto Ricans in the United States, we cannot talk about that relationship without talking about the big Puerto Rican diaspora that actually lives in the United States. So after World War II, Puerto Rico's economy shifted from being a plantation base to being industrial. And this is where all those big pharmaceutical companies came and established some factories there. But because of this, a lot of people who had jobs in plantations and agriculture lost their jobs, and in hopes of gaining higher wages and better opportunities, they left specifically for New York. Nowadays, Puerto Ricans are found in almost every state. New York has a big concentration. Florida has a great concentration.
Lancaster near Philly has a lot of Puerto Ricans.
Yes, all of that. So Puerto Ricans back then settled in the Bronx, Harlem, Queens, and Washington Heights. And at this time, in the 60s, the term New Yorican was originated because of this artistic and literary movement that talked about the experience of leaving the island for the big city. It talks about the encounters with cold for the first time. It talks about how much you miss that warmth from home. New York is very much hustle and bustle, and it's very much different from the island life that Puerto Rico is known for. And this movement was finally institutionalized in 1973 with the creation of the New Yorican Poets Cafe, where a lot of different artists came to do slam poetry and sing and write about these experiences and share with the community. So Hanna will be introducing our first artist for today.
Yeah, Mariposa Fernandez. She coined the term Diasporican in her poem Ode to Diasporicans, Pa mi gente. And the poem itself, this one, which we're going to read in a moment, questions the basis in which people judge her for not being a real Boricua. and she points out that there are differences between growing up in the Bronx and growing up in the islands. However, she points out that being Boricua is a state of heart, mind, and soul over any kind of citizenship. And it is so much more than the place, even though there is a yearning to be there, to be back in Puerto Rican or Puerto Rico. There is still that connection to the island itself. But being there or being born there directly isn't the requirement.
Yeah. So, ode to the Diasporican, or pa mi gente. Mira a mi cara puertorriqueña, mi pelo vivo, mis manos morenas. Mira mi corazón que se llena de orgullo y dime que no soy boricua. Some people say that I'm not the real thing, boricua, that is. Because I wasn't born on the enchanted island, because I was born on the mainland, north of the Spanish Harlem, because I was born in the Bronx. Some people think that I'm not bona fide, because my playground was a concrete jungle, because my Rio Grande de Loíza was the Bronx River, because my Fajardo was City Island, my Luquillo Orchard Beach. And summer nights were filled with city noises instead of coquis. And Puerto Rico was just some paradise that we only saw in pictures. What does it mean to live in between? What does it take to realize that being Boricua is a state of mind, a state of soul, a state of heart? Mira, no nací en Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico nació en mí. Mira mi cara puertorriqueña, mi pelo vivo, mis manos morenas. Mira mi corazón que se llena de orgullo y dime que no soy boricua. In the beginning section, in the last section, where it's written in Spanish, I'll translate real quick so you can get the gist of it. It says, look at my Puerto Rican face, my lively hair, my dark hands, and look at my heart full of pride and tell me that I'm not Boricua. So she's saying that, yeah, I may have not been born there, but I am so prideful and just honored to be Boricua, to have this culture backing me up. That don't you dare tell me that I'm not anything otherwise. We also will link this YouTube video where you can watch like the live version, which is pretty awesome.
Our next person is Marc Anthony. So his Marc Anthony is his stage name. His name otherwise is Marco Antonio Muñez. And he was born on September 16th in 1968 in New York City to Puerto Rican parents. Specifically, he was born and grew up in East Harlem. He's a singer, songwriter, actor, TV and record producer, philanthropist. He's very illustrious, including he has won 3 Grammys and 6 Latin Salsa Awards, and he holds the Guinness World Record for best-selling salsa artist. So he's something of a big deal. His song Preciosa is an ode to the beautiful island of Puerto Rico, and many Puerto Ricans consider it a pseudo anthem. Yeah, you definitely should watch this video of him performing it live. It's really great.
Yes. And then AOC Alexandria OcasioCortez. She was born on October 13, 1989 in New York, and she's a 3rd-generation Bronxite of Puerto Rican ancestry. So she's a congresswoman and an educator and organizer serving the 14th District of New York in the Bronx and Queens. She's also representative for this district since 2019 as a member of the Democratic Party. She's pretty cool, very outspoken, and she is committed to serving working class people over corporate interests and advocating for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. So it's cool to see Puerto Ricans just going out there and becoming these really important people that definitely will eventually have some say in the status of the island and can speak of their experiences. That's all from us for today. Thank you so much for going through this with us. I hope that this lesson has been very insightful. You're welcome to talk about it in the comments, do more research, and yeah, just we're trying to put this information out there so it's available for everybody. Next class we'll be studying about the crafts and murals in Puerto Rico. Talk a little bit about a festival, so that'll be a lot more fun, lighthearted. So yeah, just see you then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.